So let's start with the last session. It was a very interesting day today, but still we have two outstanding speeches. Baris, please, the floor is yours. Patients and physician-friendly ovarian stimulation.
Yes, thank you.
I like this title.
All right, thank you so much again, dear chairpersons, dear colleagues. It's a great pleasure, wonderful. So I will sort of follow up on my first talk. So we discussed, how stimulation evolved over time and how we can be more flexible nowadays. So I'll discuss a few variations, let's say, to ovarian stimulation. So these are the disclosures. Again, I don't think they are relevant. So we concluded that we could start stimulation anytime we wanted, okay? And then why would we do that even? So one thing is basically a lot of our patients are working. So, and these treatments take like 10 to 12 days at least until egg collection. They need to come to the clinic, so they are losing working time, they are traveling, and sometimes they don't even want to share their medical details with their employers or colleagues. So, taking time off from work is an issue. Or depending on where you're working, let's say in Dubai, I have a lot of patients who work for Emirates, so they can't really take time off as they wish. You may need to be able to flexible to schedule monitoring and likely egg collection according to their scheduling needs as well as your own scheduling needs. So that's the purpose. And what are the facts about stimulation? One, early follicular phase starts is the standard of care because our experience has accumulated over decades, so that's what we compare the results to. And if we start any other time, we won't be able to do a fresh transfer, so if we want to do a fresh transfer, that's not an option. And what is the purpose and what determines the success of stimulation? At least in the first step, you should be able to grow the majority of the available gonadotropin-sensitive follicles. So let's see, what are the guiding principles? One, just to recap, we know follicles grow at any time. I think it's continuous, if not waves. And the other fact, the other thing we need to pay attention to, the LH surge or the trigger, what you replace it with, is likely to affect follicles over a certain size, okay? Because like the smaller follicles in humans, they don't express enough LH receptors to respond to the trigger, okay? So when you are stimulating, the third thing to consider is when you are stimulating a follicle cohort, if an endogenous LH surge occurs, that would affect your growing follicles depending on their sizes. And the chances that LH surge will happen depends on which part of the cycle you are in at the moment. The other thing we can exploit is endogenous progesterone suppresses gonadotropin production and LH surges, and gonadotropin levels vary during the menstrual cycle. So I happened to give similar talks a few times over the last year or a year and a half. So sometimes from the questions or the comments from my colleagues made me realize that I may not be passing the message correctly. So the message is, yes, we can start stimulation at any time as long as we understand the endocrinology of the menstrual cycle and the physiology of folliculogenesis. So it doesn't mean, you can always start at the same dosage, same medication, and you'll get the same result. You'll need to modify your strategy depending on when you start. So early follicular phase is already the standard. We all know how to do it. So what happens if you happen to start at mid or late follicular phase? So what would be your concern if an endogenous LH surge happens before your targeted cohort reaches mature sizes? It can affect your mid-sized follicles. They may respond to the LH surge, and you may lose them. So how can you solve this problem? You either start antagonist early on, or you can do a progestin prime stimulation. So that's also expected to suppress LH surge most of the time. Or you can, if the follicles are size-wise different, if the dominant follicle has already outgrown the other cohort you want to stimulate, you can let it to ovulate. That can also help you suppress the endogenous LH, or you can trigger it to ovulate and continue suppressing. So I'll show you examples. So these are all, real cases. So there is a patient who was 35. You see the cycle day, so it's a mid-follicular start. Day 9, when she presented, that's the number of follicles, and you see one of them is 15 millimeters here. Okay. So I put her on recombinant FSH and dydrogesterone, and I just saw her like 6 days later. So this one did not ovulate. You see progesterone level did not rise as if in a luteal phase. So the other ones grew, and I could probably omit the antagonist here, but as progestin and antagonist works through different mechanisms, so I don't see a harm in using them in combination. I need to publish that though. And then we triggered, and you see, like nicely synchronized 14 oocytes. So she wanted to freeze oocytes, and we got 12 M2s. So we started on the day. She needed, she did not need a lot of monitoring in between, and with one monitoring visits, we were able to schedule collection. So another variation, that's a patient who is 45. Our setting is a bit unique because the UAE government covers IVF without an age limit. And so if a patient wants to have a child, even if she's 45, she's covered. So we have a lot of advanced stage patients. And her ovarian reserve is outstandingly good for her age. So she presented on day 12. See, still the biggest was just 12 millimeters. I don't think we necessarily need that high FSH, but that's the clinic's policy. So I put her on recombinant FSH. Saw her earlier on to see what is going on with this one. You see, it became like 18. The others are smaller. So now these ones are smaller, so I thought they wouldn't be affected by the LH surge. So they're like separate sizes. So I triggered in the middle of stimulation with an agonist, so to get this one ovulate, and which you see it did. Right? The other ones are not affected, so that disappeared, turned into corpus luteum, progesterone rose. And since this progesterone would inhibit another LH surge spontaneously, I just saw her like in 2 days. The follicles were growing nice, but progesterone started dropping, so this is something we need to figure out. So I couldn't rely on that much. I added antagonist here to prevent another LH surge, then triggered, and here's, we got 14 M2s. She got 2 blastocysts, and so there is another variation, like triggering the leading follicle in the middle of stimulation. Another patient, 37, so this is the final example, presented day 16, follicle, like leading follicle 20 millimeters, did not ovulate yet, started stimulation, saw her in a few days, so she ovulated in between. You see the progesterone level. Since this progesterone would suppress endogenous LH without adding any pituitary suppression, I saw her again in a few days. It started dropping. So I could have triggered here, but I wanted to give the smaller ones some more time. Since progesterone was dropping, I added antagonists, because maybe it wouldn't be enough to suppress endogenous LH surge. And then, triggered later, you see a nice number of growing follicles. And her AMH would be even lower, so she is 37 now. So we got 6 oocytes. Sorry, 8, 6 were mature, she got 2 euploid. And even, look at the dates, 2 years ago when she was stimulated, she was getting 7 M2s anyway. So I think that's a proper response with an easy, flexible stimulation protocol. So this is periovulatory, I would say. When she presented, 38, very low AMH, 16, I didn't think, we didn't agree, let's say, with the patient, so to do one collection for the larger one and another collection for the other 3. Instead of that, we forfeit this one, trigger, it ovulates, the other ones we stimulate, endogenous progesterone rose. I could have skipped antagonist here probably, and we got 2 M2s, 2 euploids, she was lucky. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be this way all the time, but yeah, it works. So that is mid, say, late follicular phase, periovulatory start, the way you want to define it. So luteal phase stimulations are usually lumped together in the literature so far, but I think the endocrinology of luteal phase is different in early luteal phase, mid luteal phase, late luteal phase, so I handle them differently. Early luteal phase, so your concern, so the patient has already ovulated, her progesterone is rising, so you would expect it to suppress an endogenous LH surge, so you can do gonadotrophin-only stimulation, probably, but it can decline before your follicles reach maturation. So what can you do? You can either monitor and use an antagonist or do a PPOS just from beginning to start to the end, maybe easier, and wait until it declines. So here's one, 16. She already ovulated, day 16, 37, corpus luteum, there is no dominant follicle, corpus luteum, endogenous progesterone is 15. So I gave her long-acting FSH. Out of curiosity, I saw her in between. This was dropping, progesterone was dropping, but the follicles are growing, fine. I thought this may be still enough for another 2 days. Actually, I could have triggered her in 2 days, but it happened to be a Friday. So we don't do collections on Sundays. So I need to push 1 more day. I added, recombinant. And since progesterone really dropped, I added antagonist and triggered on Saturday. Nice cohort, and we got 13 M2s. So she's 37. Out of 13 M2s, she got actually 5 blastocysts. She didn't have a euploid one, but I don't think it's relevant to stimulation. So mid-luteal, the progesterone is already high, but it will likely decline before the follicles reach maturation, so you need to add some other method to prevent LH surge. And secondly, by the time of collection, she may be having her period, okay? But the advantage, I think there's a distinct advantage of mid-luteal, because this is the time when endogenous gonadotrophins are the lowest, the follicles are slowest, and they are likely the most synchronized. So you can have a more homogeneous cohort. So if I would choose one time in the whole cycle to start stimulation without a fresh transfer, if everything was up to me, I think I would go for mid-luteal. Anyways, here are the possible solutions. Either progestin or later on adding antagonist. Here's an example. So the patient is on day 22. She comes, progesterone high. So recombinant with progesterone, monitoring, they're all growing synchronously. Here, the problem is endocrine monitoring gets a bit complicated because some of the estrogen you're measuring is coming from corpus luteum. As corpus luteum undergoes atresia, its estrogen production also declines. So you cannot always see estrogen levels consistent with follicles, but if you wait long enough, it recovers as the follicles grow. Again, here I did a combo because these are like, progesterone dropped, and it wouldn't be probably enough. So this might have been enough by itself, most likely, but as this is unconventional, sort of new, I prefer to use both of them. So you see, like, she got 18 M2s, 5, so 3, 6 blastocysts, and 3 were euploids at 40. So nice. And when you combine all these things together, you see with the examples, so this is what we published together with Professor Lamarca and Nikos. It was a paper triggered by a poolside conversation. But anyways, so it was good. When you review the literature, you see like the quality is not that high. They're not necessarily all randomized trials, but the findings are consistent, okay? So whatever metric you look at it, so duration of stimulation, if you start in the luteal phase, it tends to take slightly longer, but not much, because you start with lower endogenous gonadotrophins. Gonadotrophin consumption is similar or slightly higher. Obviously, if it takes longer, it would be slightly higher. But oocyte yield is also similar. Right? It's like either similar or higher, most likely because of synchrony, if the patient has enough follicles, right? And if you look at the developmental potential of the oocytes, like fertilization, blastulation, euploid rates, etc., so far the data is reassuring. None of the studies suggested worse results, either similar or even better, but I think it's similar. Clinical outcome, once you do a frozen embryo transfer later on, gives you the similar results. So I guess if we don't have to do, or if we don't prefer to do, a fresh embryo transfer, so we don't necessarily have to start stimulation on a particular day, because I think it's also like the uncertainty with when will I have my period, when will be day 2, day 3, when, it's usually not us doing it in the clinics, but our nurses, they get a lot of questions. So what happens if my day 2 is on a Sunday? So who do I call? I mean, or they can't plan anything. So basically, with this flexibility, it decreases the stress on everyone, and it may liberate the treatment as long as we understand the endocrinology of the cycle, both the menstrual cycle plus a stimulated cycle. And these examples are just some real life cases. I don't claim in any way they are the only correct way of doing things, or those are the only ways to modify the treatments. You could have done it with one or the other, not necessarily combo. But as data accumulates, we'll probably learn more about it. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.